A slow and solemn hush seems to settle over the ancient world as the lineage of Seth begins to rise like a quiet thread of light woven through a landscape, shadowed by violence, ambition, and the restless hunger of early humanity, carrying within it a fragile yet unbroken memory of the God who shaped the dust and breathed his own life into it. The world after Eden felt vast and untamed, its horizons stretching outward in wild, ungoverned silence. Yet within that silence lived the echo of a loss so deep it shaped the very air the early generations breathed. Adam and Eve walked forward with the weight of memory pressing upon them, remembering the garden they could no longer touch, the voice they once heard without fear, and the promise that one day a descendant would rise to crush the serpent's power. Their children grew in this tension between memory and exile, and the story of humanity began to unfold with a mixture of longing and fracture. Cain's violence tore open the first wound in human history, a wound that revealed how quickly the heart could turn away from the God who formed it, and how easily jealousy could become bloodshed. Yet even in the aftermath of that tragedy, life continued, and Adam and Eve bore another son, Seth, whose birth felt like a quiet mercy in a world already trembling under the weight of sin. Seth grew not in the shadow of Cain's rage, but in the hope that God had not abandoned the human story, and as he matured, the world around him began to shift. People multiplied, settlements formed, and the early generations learned to shape tools, cultivate land, and build communities that pulsed with both creativity and corruption. But within Seth's line, something different stirred an instinct to remember the God who had spoken creation into being, a desire to call upon his name even when the world around them drifted toward forgetfulness. This fragile devotion became a thread of continuity, sign that the divine promise had not been lost in the chaos of early humanity. And as the generations of Seth began to grow, their quiet faithfulness stood as a contrast to the rising tide of violence and self-exaltation that marked the descendants of Cain, inviting us to linger in the tension between two paths and to reflect on the legacy we choose to carry forward, even as we pause to consider how this ancient story still reaches toward us today, drawing us deeper into its unfolding mystery as you consider sharing this moment with someone who needs to remember that light can still rise in dark places. The generations that followed Seth unfolded slowly, each name in the genealogy carrying with it a lifetime of struggle, hope, and the quiet persistence of faith in a world that seemed increasingly determined to forget its maker. These early descendants lived long lives, their years stretching across centuries, giving them time to witness the rise and fall of communities, the spread of human ingenuity, and the deepening divide between those who sought God and those who pursued their own desires without restraint. The world was changing, and with each generation the contrast between the two lines Seth's and Cain's grew sharper, like two paths diverging across the same landscape. Cain's descendants built cities, forged tools of bronze and iron, and shaped a culture driven by ambition and self-expression. Yet beneath their achievements lay a growing hardness of heart, a willingness to embrace violence, and a pride that pushed God further and further from their thoughts. But in the line of Seth, a different rhythm took root, one marked by remembrance and reverence. These early patriarchs carried forward the stories of Eden, the memory of God's voice, and the promise of redemption that had been spoken in the wake of humanity's first rebellion. They lived with an awareness that the world was not as it should be, yet they refused to surrender to despair. Instead, they called upon the name of the Lord, anchoring their identity not in the cities they built or the tools they forged, but in the God who had shaped their beginnings. This devotion did not shield them from the brokenness of the world, but it gave them a direction, a purpose, and a hope that stretched beyond the horizon of their own lifetimes. As the generations continued, the world around them grew increasingly corrupt, and the weight of human sin pressed heavily upon creation itself. Yet within this growing darkness, the line of Seth remained a witness, a quiet, steady reminder that God had not been forgotten by all. and that his promise still lived within the hearts of those who chose to seek him. And it is here, in this widening contrast between faithfulness and rebellion, that the story begins to turn toward the evidence that reveals just how deeply this ancient lineage shaped the unfolding history of humanity. The genealogy of Seth stands as one of the earliest structured records of human history. And its presence within the ancient text offers a remarkable window into how early cultures preserved identity, memory, and divine purpose. In the ancient Near East, genealogies were not mere lists of names. They were declarations of legitimacy, continuity, and divine alignment. The line of Seth functions in precisely this way, presenting a lineage that traces not only biological descent, but spiritual inheritance, marking a people who oriented their lives toward the God who had spoken creation into being. Archaeological discoveries across Mesopotamia reveal that early civilizations placed immense value on genealogical records, often inscribing them on clay tablets to preserve the memory of kings, priests, and foundational ancestors. These records served to anchor communities in their origins, providing a sense of identity that stretched backward into the distant past. The structure of Seth's genealogy mirrors these ancient patterns, yet it also stands apart in its theological depth. Unlike the royal lists of Sumer or Akkad, which often exaggerated lifespans to elevate kings to near-divine status, the biblical genealogy presents long lives not as symbols of divinity, but as markers of a world still close to its creation, where the effects of decay had not yet fully taken hold. This distinction reveals a worldview in which humanity remains firmly human, yet profoundly connected to the God who formed them. The repeated refrain, "and he died," underscores this reality, grounding the narrative in the universal human experience of mortality, while pointing toward the need for the promised redemption. Moreover, the presence of figures like Enoch, who walked with God and was taken rather than experiencing death, introduces a theological dimension that sets the Sethite line apart from surrounding cultures. Ancient Mesopotamian texts speak of sages and semi-divine heroes who bridged the gap between gods and men. But the biblical account reframes this idea, presenting Enoch not as a demigod, but as a human whose intimacy with God transcended the boundaries of mortality. This contrast highlights the unique theological vision embedded within the genealogy, revealing a lineage defined not by power or conquest, but by devotion, faithfulness, and the preservation of divine promise. The story of Seth's line moves forward with a quiet but steady gravity, unfolding across centuries in which the world around them grew increasingly turbulent, as though creation itself strained under the weight of human rebellion. Each generation carried the memory of Eden like a fading ember. Yet within the line of Seth, that ember refused to die, glowing softly in hearts that still longed for the God who had shaped their beginnings. As the descendants of Cain built cities that pulsed with ambition and self-exaltation, the Sethites lived with a different orientation, one shaped not by the pursuit of dominance, but by the desire to walk in the ways of the one who had spoken life into the dust. Their lives were marked by a reverence that set them apart, a quiet devotion that stood in stark contrast to the rising tide of corruption that swept across the earth. Among these generations, the figure of Enoch emerges like a sudden beam of light piercing through the gathering darkness. His life was not defined by the length of his years, but by the depth of his communion with God, a communion so profound that the boundary between earth and heaven seemed to thin around him. While others lived and died, Enoch walked with God in a way that defied the growing distance between humanity and its Creator. And his departure from the world without tasting death became a sign that intimacy with God was still possible even in an age of increasing wickedness. His story would echo through the generations, a reminder that faithfulness was not forgotten and that God still drew near to those who sought him with undivided hearts. Yet, even as this quiet faithfulness persisted, the world around the Sethites grew darker, the violence and corruption of Cain's line spreading like a shadow across the land. The contrast between the two lineages sharpened with each passing century, revealing a world divided between those who remembered God and those who had turned away. And in this widening divide, the story presses forward toward a moment of reckoning, inviting us to linger in the tension between devotion and rebellion, and to share this unfolding narrative with someone who needs to be reminded that faithfulness still matters, even when the world grows dark. The evidence surrounding the line of Seth becomes even more compelling when viewed through the lens of ancient Near Eastern cultural patterns, where genealogies served not only as historical records, but as theological declarations. In Mesopotamian societies, genealogies often functioned as legitimizing tools for kingship, linking rulers to divine or heroic ancestors to establish authority. The biblical genealogy of Seth, however, subverts this pattern by grounding its authority not in human power, but in divine promise. The structure of the genealogy emphasizes continuity, faithfulness, and the preservation of a spiritual lineage that stands in contrast to the self-exaltation of surrounding cultures. This contrast becomes particularly striking when compared to texts like the Sumerian King List, which presents exaggerated lifespans and semi-divine rulers as a means of elevating human kingship. The biblical account, by contrast, presents long lifespans not as symbols of divinity, but as reflections of a world still close to its creation, where the effects of decay had not yet fully taken hold. Archaeological discoveries further illuminate the cultural context in which the Sethite genealogy emerged. Excavations across ancient Mesopotamia have uncovered clay tablets containing genealogical lists, kingly records, and ancestral narratives that reveal how deeply early civilizations valued the preservation of lineage. These records often served to anchor communities in their origins, providing a sense of identity and continuity that stretched across generations. The biblical genealogy participates in this cultural practice while simultaneously redefining it, presenting a lineage not of kings or conquerors, but of those who called upon the name of the Lord. This theological emphasis sets the Sethite line apart, highlighting a worldview in which true legitimacy arises not from human achievement, but from alignment with the divine. The presence of Enoch within the genealogy adds another layer of evidence that distinguishes the biblical account from its ancient counterparts. While Mesopotamian texts speak of sages and heroes who bridged the gap between gods and men, the biblical portrayal of Enoch reframes this concept through the lens of monotheism, presenting him not as a demigod, but as a human whose intimacy with God transcended mortality. This distinction underscores the unique theological vision embedded within the genealogy, revealing a lineage defined by devotion rather than power, by faithfulness rather than conquest. And as we consider the weight of this evidence, we are invited to reflect on how the ancient world preserved its memories, how God worked through ordinary lives to shape extraordinary history, and how sharing this unfolding revelation might deepen someone else's understanding of the story that still shapes us today. The story of Seth's line reaches its emotional and narrative climax as the world around them descends into a depth of corruption that threatens to swallow creation itself. Violence spread across the earth like a rising flood, filling the land with bloodshed, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of self. The descendants of Cain built cities that pulsed with innovation, yet were hollowed out by moral decay, their achievements overshadowed by the darkness that grew within their hearts. The world groaned under the weight of human rebellion, and the contrast between the two lineages, Seth's and Cain's, became a chasm that could no longer be ignored. Yet within this growing darkness, the line of Seth continued to carry the fragile flame of devotion, a flame that flickered but did not die. It is within this lineage that Noah emerges, a man whose life becomes the hinge upon which the entire story of early humanity turns. Noah's righteousness did not arise from perfection, but from a heart oriented toward God in a world that had forgotten him. His life stood as a solitary beacon in an age where wickedness had become the norm, and his faithfulness became the vessel through which God would preserve the human story. The genealogy of Seth narrows toward him with intentional precision, revealing that the promise spoken in Eden had not been lost, that the thread of redemption still wound its way through history even when the world seemed determined to unravel itself. As the narrative moves toward the moment of divine intervention, the weight of the story presses heavily upon us, reminding us that faithfulness matters even when it feels small. That devotion carries significance even when the world grows dark, and that God's purposes continue to unfold through those who choose to walk with Him. And in this moment of rising tension, as the world stands on the brink of judgment and renewal, you might consider sharing this unfolding story with someone who needs to remember that even in the darkest times, a single life aligned with God can change the course of history. The full weight of the evidence surrounding the line of Seth gathers into a single, sweeping revelation. This genealogy is not merely a record of ancient names, but a carefully preserved thread of divine intention woven through the earliest centuries of human history. When examined through the lens of archaeology, ancient literature, and theological reflection, the Sethite lineage emerges as a counter-narrative to the cultural currents of its time, standing in deliberate contrast to the self-exaltation of surrounding civilizations. In Mesopotamia, genealogies often serve to elevate kings, justify dynasties, or link rulers to mythical figures whose stories blurred the line between humanity and divinity. The biblical account, however, grounds its lineage in the ordinary rhythms of human life birth. Years lived, children born, and death, while simultaneously revealing a spiritual continuity that transcends the rise and fall of early societies. This contrast becomes even more striking when viewed alongside archaeological discoveries that illuminate the world in which these genealogies were formed. Excavations across ancient Sumer, Akkad, and early Babylon have uncovered king lists, ancestral tablets, and mythic genealogies that reflect a worldview shaped by polytheism, divine kingship, and the pursuit of earthly power. These records often portray rulers as semi-divine beings whose authority flowed from their proximity to the gods, and whose exaggerated lifespans served to reinforce their elevated status. The biblical genealogy of Seth, by contrast, presents long lifespans not as symbols of divinity, but as reflections of a world still close to its creation, where the effects of decay had not yet fully taken hold. This distinction reveals a theological vision in which humanity remains fully human, yet profoundly connected to the God who formed them. The presence of Enoch within the genealogy further underscores this unique perspective. Ancient Near Eastern texts speak of sages, heroes, and semi-divine intermediaries who bridge the gap between gods and men. But the biblical portrayal of Enoch reframes this concept entirely. Enoch is not a demigod or mythical figure. He is a human whose intimacy with God transcended mortality, revealing that closeness to the divine is not the privilege of kings or heroes, but the inheritance of those who walk with God in faithfulness. His story becomes a theological anchor within the genealogy, a reminder that devotion, not power, defines true greatness. The genealogy's culmination in Noah adds yet another layer of significance. Archaeological evidence from flood narratives across Mesopotamia, such as the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh, reveals that ancient cultures preserved memories of a great deluge. Yet their accounts differ dramatically in tone and theology. In these stories, the gods act out of caprice, annoyance, or fear of human population growth. The biblical account, however, presents the flood as a moral and relational response to human corruption, and Noah's role as the preserver of humanity flows not from divine favoritism, but from righteousness rooted in the lineage of Seth. This alignment between genealogy and narrative reveals a coherent theological vision in which God works through ordinary lives to preserve His promise and shape the future of humanity. It is a reminder that history is not shaped solely by kings, conquerors, or empires, but by those who choose to walk with God even when the world grows dark, and that the quiet faithfulness of a single lineage can carry the weight of divine purpose across centuries. The story of Seth's line leaves us standing before the quiet strength of a lineage that carried hope through a world unraveling around it, reminding us that even in the darkest ages, God preserves a people who remember Him and keep His promise alive. And as this ancient thread of faithfulness continues to echo across time, you might let this moment settle deeply and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that light can endure even when the world grows dim.